Hey guys, welcome to another episode of eMoney Poker. Today is another freeze out tournament, and this one was probably one of my craziest sessions. It was a lot of fun, and there was just a lot of excitement. I can't really say too much without getting into it, so let's just get straight to it.
So the first hand of the night, we look down at pocket aces. So since we're six-handed here and I'm in the big blind, I'm not really expecting a lot of crazy action to come before me. So when it limps over to me, I raise it up to 1600. And I know this is a little ambitious, but there's a lot of regulars that I usually see, and they can play pretty loose. So I only end up getting one caller, and that's the hijack. So off to the flop, we see that it's 10-8 for rainbow. So great board for my range. So I'm gonna lead out for 3500. And after a little bit of deliberation, the hijack ends up deciding to call. The turn ends up bringing the nine of spades. So yet again, it doesn't really change much. So I decide to check. And then he bets out for 3,500 and I decide just to call. And then the river brings the two of spades. So I decide on 7,500 to bet. And after a little bit, he ends up calling, and we see that he had queens. A few hands go by, and then I look down at pocket queens on the button. So just getting premium after premium here at this table. Now that we're like 8-handed or 9-handed, so we finally have more people at the table, I decided to lead out for 1200, and I'm mainly just doing this to try to change up my bet sizing. But I end up getting the small blind and under the gun players to call. Then the flop is Queen Jack 5, so top set, they check, and I get a little bit antsy, and they both fold pretty quick.
Wow, what a start to this tournament. Only in level 2, and I'm sitting at about 65,000 in chips. I'm just running so good. Those aces in that first 5 or 6 hands was awesome. The queens I just had was great as well. I think I probably could have downsized a little bit on my C bet after the flop, but I was really worried about another spade coming out, so I didn't really want to push it. But yeah, I'm super happy with where I'm sitting, and let's keep this going.
On to the next one. It's our first non-premium hand of the vlog, and we look down at ace 10 offsuit on the button. So this one was kind of an interesting play. Let me know what you think. But the middle position player ends up deciding to call, and the cutoff ends up betting for 1600. So at this point, I decide just to call, mainly because I think it's great to try and hold this position. And I don't know why, but in the moment, I'm not too worried about anybody behind me re-raising. So that ends up happening. We end up getting the under the gun and middle position players to call. Now, 4 ways to the flop, we see this Queen Jack 3 with 2 diamonds. So I do have an open-ender here, but I don't have any diamond of any sort. So I just decide to check, and the turn brings the 9 of spades. So now I'm double guttered, and I don't really know what to do here. When it ends up checking over to the middle position player, he ends up betting for 10k, and this is just way too much for me to call. I know I have a lot of chips, but no. Here we are in the under the gun 1 position, and we look down at 9-8 of diamonds. So I said this a few videos back, but I don't really play a lot of suited connectors. So I thought, yeah, why not? I end up deciding just to call. I felt like if this was like a Jack 10 at least, I would feel more comfortable in raising. But anyways, off to the flop, we see it's Jack 9 4 rainbow. So there is a diamond on there, and I do have a pair. I'm trying to think of a good amount to bet, and I end up just hitting 1100. Granted, looking back on it, this obviously doesn't really make that much sense, especially since I limped in early position. I not really repping a jack here, and if I had something like nines or fours or something like that, I would have raised pre-flop. So I ended up only getting one caller, and the turn brings us 3 of diamonds. So now I am coming close to my flush draw, but it has to go check, check. River is the ace of clubs, so I completely miss, and I'm only repping third pair here. So once this ace comes out, the under the gun player ends up betting out for 5k. This is definitely an interesting spot to be in because his line that he's taking on these bets isn't really making sense. If anything, I could imagine that he's on some kind of ace 7, maybe ace 8 offsuit, and he just happened to get there on the river, so I fold. Next up, I look down at king 8 of spades in the low jack, and when the under the gun 1 player decides to just call, I decided raising it up to 1600, which I don't know if it was just me being upset about how the last hand played out, but I decided to raise to 1600, and I end up only getting the... Now that we're at the flop, we see that it is 10, 8, 8 rainbow. So I end up flopping trips, and that's very nice for me. When the small blind checks, the under the gun player ends up taking for a while, and he ends up deciding to bet for 2000. So obviously I'm not going anywhere for that price. Honestly, I probably could have waited a little bit longer before throwing those chips out, but I hopped onto it pretty quick. And then after a little thinking, the small blind ends up folding. The turn ends up bringing the 6 of clubs. So now that there's a flush draw out there, I think that my opponent is more likely to stick around and try and get lucky. But he ends up leading out for 6k. So I decide just to call. I don't think that this is really the spot for me to try and raise here. And the river brings the jack of diamonds. So let me know what you think about this play. So he ends up checking, and I am sitting there thinking about it for a while, and I am worried on a check jam, so I end up deciding checking, and afterwards he said he was going to, if I bet. Alright, it has been a little bit since we've picked up a decent hand, so in the big blind I look down at pocket tens. So very happy with this one here. So the under the gun, middle position, hijack, and the small blind all decide to call. And I obviously go for a raise here. I end up choosing on 1800, and the under the gun ends up deciding to call, as well as the hijack and the cutoff. After a little bit of thinking about it, the small blind does end up eventually deciding to fold. So now we are going 4 ways to the flop. The flop now brings king, queen, 4 with 2 clubs. So this definitely hits my range here. So I decide to down bet a little bit to 1600. And the under the gun player is taking a little bit of time to think about it, and he ends up deciding to fold. So I'm not really sure what was going through his mind, but Anyways, the hijack ends up deciding to call, and the cutoff calls as well. So the turn ends up bringing the six of clubs, so the flush does get there, and I decide to c-bet for 3,500. So definitely an interesting line that I'm trying to take. Honestly, I'm not really sure what I'm trying to say here in this story, but he ends up calling me. River brings a two of diamonds, so I decide to check, and he checks pretty quick. And of course, he ended up having the winning hand. So going into this last video of the vlog, I looked down at ace jack of spades in the under the gun position. This video has definitely had no shortage of premium hands, and I'm here for it. So anyways, so I end up bumping things up to 2,100, and then the low jack actually decides to raise again up to 5,000. So definitely an interesting spot here. I obviously am gonna call at least, but this is not a fold. Definitely not a jam. I could be up against like kings or queens or something. But the flop brings ace 5-2 rainbow. So I hit my top pair with a decent kicker. I decide on a check, mainly just a trap, and it ends up working, but not to the extent that I thought it would. He ends up leading out for 6,200. And so I was planning on check raising, but if I ended up doing that, I'm committing a decent amount of my chips, assuming that he doesn't then just re-raise on me. So I just decide on a call, and the turn brings the ace of diamonds. So now I hit trips. It's way less likely for him to have an ace. So I decide to check again for a trap, and yet again it works because he ends up leading out for 8K this time. Again, I'm just trying to play this slow. I know in hindsight it doesn't really feel this way. I think this is definitely worth raising, but I end up deciding just to call. And then the river brings the four of diamonds. So I check, and he ends up checking, and then we see that, wait, what the fuck just happened?
You guessed it. I had to end the video on a cliffhanger. Got to keep y'all interested in coming back and everything. So that is it for this episode. I'll get part 2 of this video out in the next couple weeks or so stick around. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and I'll see y'all in the next one.